Welcome, everybody. Joe Tarnowski with ECRM, and I have a special guest with me today. Amy Herman is the president of Art of Perception and the author of Visual Intelligence, which is an amazing book. I highly recommend it. What she does is she uses works of art to help people to sharpen their observation, analysis, and communication skills. And she works with all types of organizations, doctors, Navy SEALs, law enforcement, where the ability to perceive and communicate effectively is extremely important. And what we're going to do today is we're going to apply these learnings to virtual meetings so that both, whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side of the screen, you could better observe what's going on and, most importantly, communicate effectively between each other. So, Amy, thank you so much for joining us. And to kick it off, could you give us a little background on what you do, how you do it with the Art of Perception?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me as a guest today. In these weird pandemic times, I'm always happy to share my information and help other people rethink how they do their work, just in these weird times. How do we shift our perspective? So by way of background, I am a recovering attorney and an art historian. Once you're an attorney, you're always an attorney. And I like to think that I took the practical aspects of each of those fields, visual analysis and legal analysis, and I combined them 20 years ago when I started this program called the Art of Perception. And in a nutshell, I teach leaders across the professional spectrum to look at works of art to sharpen their observation, perception, and communication skills. And I know what most people think. They roll their eyes and think, yeah, looking at art, what the hell does that have to do with my job? And the answer is everything. Because for us to work effectively, we all need to understand what we see. And more importantly, how do we communicate what we see? And the title of the book that you just showed, thank you very much, is called Visual Intelligence. And people ask me, what is visual intelligence? And basically, visual intelligence is the ability to see what other people don't. How do you see what other people don't, not only to stay at the forefront of innovation, but to bring to your clients and your stakeholders things that they themselves wouldn't see? So I started the program back in 2000 for medical students, and in 2004, I adapted it for the New York City Police Department, for law enforcement. And the collaboration hit the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and my world exploded. And I got calls from all over the world, and people said, come help us to see like you did those cops in New York. And I really can't help people to see, but I have a very simple, straightforward methodology that I look forward to sharing with you and your listeners and your viewers about not taking on a whole new methodology, but giving them the tools to see and communicate more effectively.
Excellent. And there's one example that you've given in the past that really drove home why it's so critical to be able to observe things effectively. And that was the Chandra Levy incident that happened years back. Can you talk a little bit about that? And because I think it really drives home the importance of it.
Sure. Some people may remember back in May of 2001, a congressional intern named Chandra Levy. She worked for a congressman named Gary Condit. She went running in Rock Creek Park and she disappeared. And it was all over the news. He was her congressman was a person of interest. They couldn't find her. So when the chief of detectives of the Metropolitan Police Department gave his instructions to search for Chandra Levy's body, he said, I want you to search 100 yards from every road in Rock Creek Park. He gave the instruction. He said, I want you to search 100 yards from every trail in Rock Creek Park. And when the detectives got to the park, he repeated his instruction, but he changed one word. He said, I want you to search 100 yards from every road in Rock Creek Park. Now, there are thousands of trails and maybe 25 roads. He changed one word, trail to road, and they searched they searched the park 100 yards from every road, and they found nothing. When Chandra Levy's remains were eventually found a year later, where was she? 75 yards from a trail. Now, am I going to say that if he used the same word with certainty, they would have found her any sooner? I don't know that. But a year later, what happens? She's disintegrated. The forensic evidence is useless, absolutely useless. And it took them so long to get someone to convict someone. And when they finally did, they didn't have the evidence, and he was eventually released from jail for lack of evidence. The choice of one word. And the underlying theme in my whole presentation is words matter. We need to think very carefully, especially in a virtual environment, because this is all we have to go on. You know, we can't shake hands at the end of a meeting and say, you know, glad I was able to tell you about X. You have one chance to get the words right, and we can't squander that opportunity.
And that's a good point that you bring up, is this, even though you're using art to kind of help people sharpen their skills, this is more about just visual. It's auditory. It's what you're hearing, what you're saying. You know, it's about communications, and you're just using the art as the tools to kind of help in that area.
Exactly. And if you'll permit me to share my screen, I'd love to show you a visual. Not that I don't love talking to you, but the visuals are so much more effective, so you can see what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to show you.
And I just want to give a note to people who may be listening to this on the podcast. Now, you're going to get a lot from the concepts that are discussed here. However, you definitely want to watch the video to see the art as it relates to the concepts as well.
And I'll be as descriptive as possible. I'll practice what I preach and describe as much as I can. What you're looking at now on the screen is a painting by a man named Philip Barlow. And he's a South African artist. I love his work. If your gut instinct is to take off your glasses or rub your eyes to bring this painting into focus, it's doing its job. It's purposefully painted like this, and I use it to open all of my sessions to remind people that you need to bring the world into focus every single day, and even multiple times a day, because in our world, things change by the hour. You know, tomorrow we're going to have one president at 11, and we're going to have another one at noon. Like, everything changes, and it's up to you. If you're going to be on the edge of what you do and be at the forefront, you have to rub your eyes all day. You have to bring the world into focus. And so this is a painting that I use to help to remind people. It's a beautiful painting, but it's out of focus. And it's meant to be that way. It's a harsh reminder. Rub your eyes and clear your vision. Because the truth is, this is what's happened to our world. And what I'm showing you is our beautiful country, America, literally turned upside down. And I'm showing you 4 different cities around the world. The pandemic has upended every single aspect of our lives, personally, professionally, economically, socially, you know, injustice, and everything has been upended. And, you know, Winston Churchill, I steal a line from him all the time. He said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I want to use this pandemic to help people in all different professions to come out of this having thrived, not just survived. And one more slide, it's because this is not an option. What is this? It's a deer in the headlights. And when you are in retail, or you are in sales, or you have vendors or clients, you cannot be a deer in the headlights. It's not a leadership position. And so I give people the tools. I hope I give people the tools to avoid being a deer in the headlights.
And a lot of people, especially initially when we were all doing everything virtual, everybody had to do their meetings virtually, not just on our ECRM Connect platform, but on their own.
Right.
And there was that deer in the headlights sort of sense, especially in the initial months. Now people are embracing it more. They're doing it all the time, almost too much, where they get Zoom fatigue, I believe the term is. But it's a different environment. It's a different, and can you talk a little bit about that in moving from an in-person environment to a virtual environment, and the importance of observation and perception and communication, and how it's changed from one environment to another, and the importance of adjusting to it now?
Well, lucky for you, I have a visual example of this.
All right.
Teed me up perfectly. I'm showing you a work of art, which is my best way to communicate. And it's by a woman named Cornelia Parker. Now, bear with me here, Joe, because I know what you're going to think. You're going to think the woman's got too much time on her hands, but bear with me, all right? So she works in Britain, and she built the shed that you see on the left. And what is in a shed? In New York City, we don't have sheds because we don't have backyards. But what goes into a shed? All the things that you need for outside and stuff that you don't want to keep in the house, but you don't want to throw it away. And then she moved her shed to a field. That's the picture on the right. And with the help of the British government, now bear with me, she put bombs in the shed and she exploded the shed. All right? Now again, I know she has too much time on her hands, but bear with me. So what Cornelia Parker did, and this is what's relevant for ECRM for all your participants and all your members. After she exploded the shed, the artist went into the field and she picked up each of the pieces, the blown apart contents and the piece of the shed, and they were burned and distorted and charred beyond recognition. And she had to repurpose them, reframe them, and rethink them to build the sculpture on the right.
Huh.
And it is an amazing work of art. It was at Tate Britain in England, and I was lucky enough to see it. And you walk into the room, and your first thought is, what the hell? I mean, it's huge and it's phenomenal. And when you then read the label and you realize that it was a blown apart shed that was put back together. And what I think is particularly cool about it and relevant for your participants is the shed in the upper left-hand corner had one light in it. And the artist decided to put one light in the center of the sculpture, having no idea the shadows that it would create and the dimensions. My way to connect the dots for you is all of our sheds have been blown up. Individually and collectively, everything we know, all our business practices, all our best practices, all of our ways of solving problems and creating new products and presentations have been blown to bits. And now I want to help people to look at those bits and repurpose them and reframe them. Because when you're dealing virtually, you don't have a handshake. Yeah, you can look someone in the eye, but you can't see the aha moment. You can't go have a drink afterwards. You can't say, you know what, let's meet in an hour and bring this all together. You don't have that person to person. So I want to give people the tools not only to put their shed back together, but to make it better than it was before. But the caveat that I'll give you, I know this isn't a shed anymore. I know it's not a functioning shed, but I believe that this can be a time for innovation. But what that involves is looking at your existing resources through new lenses and saying, you know, what do I have at my disposal and how can I use it now that I need it?
And it's so true, because every way that we interact, now we've been hosting these meetings in person for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's completely different. The meetings are the same, the process is the same, all of that is the same, but now they are limited to this real estate right here, this box, and what they can put in it, whether it's behind them, whether they lift it up in this, and then also that's all they can see on your end, and you have to make adjustments. In fact, you saw what I just did. I pointed at you and you can't see my finger because I'm pointing at your window. Now you have to learn to point at your camera wherever your camera is.
Even looking at your camera, because when I look at my art, I make sure that the art is centered so that I'm looking at the camera, so it looks as if I'm looking at the client. But if I'm looking down here or looking to the side, it looks as if you're not making eye contact with the client. And eye contact is one of the most important things when you have a client meeting, and to be aware of where the camera is on your computer and to make sure that you have maximum, the best face-to-face that you can possibly have. Mm-hmm. And to illustrate this again, I just want to show you how important it is to shift things and change things and think about physically looking. And if you don't mind one more visual example, I'm showing you a painting. And I, you know, in my training sessions, when I work with people, you never have to know who artists are or the years that painted. That doesn't matter. I'm showing you this painting. It happens to be from 1593. What is it? It's a black bowl with some onions and some carrots and mushrooms and leeks and turnips. It's a lovely painting, but the power of the painting is revealed when you turn it upside down. And the painting becomes the vegetable gardener. See his hat and his face and his nose. And it reminds me of what the late Dr. Wayne Dyer said. He said, change the way you look at things and the things you look at change. I always say that twice. Change the way you look at things and the things you look at change. So if you change the way you look at virtual presentations or you change the way you look at products, those things actually change and you see other ways to use them, to present them, and to talk about them in the most effective ways to communicate the information that you need to convey to do your job.
And that's really important because now, and like the example we gave before, we're limited to the screens. We're limited to what's on the screen. If I'm a buyer and I have the supplier there, I need to make sure that I can see everything that I need to see. And I don't know necessarily what they have, what products. I mean, they'll take us through presentations, but it's important to make sure that I get all of the information that I want from them, whether or not it's obvious on the screen.
Right. Now, that reminds me of something else. In my presentations, I tell my participants they're never allowed to use the words obviously or clearly for the very simple reason that in this world, and even the pre-pandemic world, we work in such a complex world, nothing is obvious and even less is clear. So I'd rather people say, it appears to me to be X, instead of saying, well, obviously it's X. What if I don't know why it's X? Like, explain to me that it's X because of Y and Z. And one other point I wanted to make in response to what you just said in terms of rethinking our resources, something that I've noticed on television and on the news and even with my clients. When you are on a Zoom presentation, turn off your email and turn off the ringer on your phone. Because when it goes ding, ding, not only is it so annoying when that happens, but it tells your client, you're not the only thing I'm concentrating on right now. I'm listening for a text on my phone. Mm-hmm. And by turning off the ringer and not having it go in the background, you're sending a signal, I'm concentrating on you. You have all my attention. And even though everyone has a phone next to them when they're in a Zoom presentation, you don't have to let the whole world know that you're getting a text. And it's something that's small. Turn off your email and turn off your ringer, and then you can concentrate, or at least give the illusion that somebody has your full attention. Small thing, but it's something we need to consider, and most people don't. And how annoying is it when you're talking to someone and you're hearing ding, ding? It's awful.
Yeah, that's part of my routine before every interview is I shut off my email so I don't get the alerts. I disable we have our phone system is an app on the computer. So I turn that off, off my team so I don't get any beeps during the meeting.
Absolutely.
Because even if the other viewer can't hear it, it's still going to take me away for a second.
And your eye, your gaze is going to shift to your phone.
Mm-hmm.
And people notice things like that, even if it's subconscious. So when we're rethinking this platform and our resources, and we want to give people our whole attention. And one more slide, if you don't mind. This is about shifting your perspective. And everybody has to do it. And the people that roll with shifting their perspective come across as smoother and more conversant, and therefore they look more flexible. And I'm showing you a picture of his name is JR. He's an artist. And I want people to shift their perspective like this guy did. JR takes pictures of people and he blows them up to billboard size and he puts them all over the world, sidewalks, runways, buildings. But early in his career, he had a problem. He never got a permit to do any of this. And some countries didn't like that he would just put his photographs wherever he wanted. So they issued warrants for his arrest. And while those warrants were pending, he was commissioned to do this portrait. And I think it's brilliant. It's called, I'm sure you guessed it, Self-Portrait in a Woman's Eye, Kenya, 2009. And the reason I think it's brilliant is he shifted his perspective on what self-portraiture is, and he took a picture of himself and you don't know what he looks like. Why? Because he's trying to evade arrest. If people know what you look like, you're going to get arrested. But I don't think anybody in our podcast today is trying to evade arrest. So my question is, why do you have to shift your perspective? Why is it so important for the members of ECRM to think, okay, why do I need to think differently? Why? Because you need to view things through a different lens. Like, what am I showing you here? I'm showing you the towers of Notre Dame burned down in 2019. Everybody was upset. It was a terrible thing to witness. This is easy, though. You see this if you're French or you're Catholic or you're Christian or art historian. This is terrible to look at. But to really understand the damage and to understand the scope, you need to step back and take a bigger look. Because when you're limited to the screen, as you said, you only have a certain view. And so figuratively, you need to step back. This is a much more informative photograph than this. Because I'm showing you the whole cathedral and the damage. And what does this help you do? It gives you a better view of how to fix the problem. And so taking that analogy, your members, we all need to step back and get the biggest picture possible, because when you're limited to the screen, you only see one view. So after a discussion, that's when you do your research, and that's when you go onto the computer and dig deeper than you would normally dig to get a fuller view of the problem, because people might not be able to present it. Because in the end, you have to manage risk. You still have to manage risk. Do I buy this product? Do I present this product? Do I go for another meeting? I love this photograph. You're behind the wheel. Do you drive ahead, Joe? Do you continue driving on the road?
I haven't driven.
You grab a good picture, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of risk management takes on a whole new dimension when you're willing to step back and look at the picture and think about all the things that are involved.
So I think one of the important things that you mentioned too is not saying obviously or clearly, and the whole subject of avoiding subjectivity. Like, don't make assumptions. And in the context of a meeting, you're sitting across, if I'm a supplier and I'm pitching my products to a buyer,
Mhm.
you can make a lot of assumptions based on what you're seeing from on the buyer's face or attitude or whatever.
Right.
And the only thing is, where it's a lot easier in person to really see the nonverbal communication going on, the nonverbal cues that are happening.
Mhm.
Sometimes people on the screen may give off a feeling that they're not paying attention when it's not really the case. For example, if I'm talking to you right now and you're saying something to me and I start jotting down and I'm jotting down on my notebook, what does it look like on your end?
It
Like, I'm
looks
not,
like you're looking at your phone.
yeah. So, and this is where the communication part, and I know we're going to dip into that later. I know sometimes what I'll do is if I'm talking to someone virtually, I'm going to say, I'm going to take some notes, so I may not be looking at you. I'm not, texting or emailing,
Perfect.
and then I'll just do it. But I think that is one thing that's so important on the communication side, and just not to assume anything based on what's
Absolutely.
going on the other side of the screen.
You're absolutely right. And in that same vein, when people cross their arms, frequently people take that as, not accepting or closing off. And I always tell people, I try to make people put them at ease. And I say, it's freezing where I am.
That's
And
what I was going to say. What if it's cold? Yeah.
it's cold. And I just want you to know I'm not, not listening to you or not trying to close myself off. It's cold in here. And so going out of your way to explain things that you would take for granted, I think brings everyone onto the same page. Mm-hmm. And again, a slide, you're like teeing me up perfectly for these slides.
Even with an aside.
Yes. Well, what I want to tell people, and I think this illustrates it beautifully, the painting in the front that you see with the blue and the black and the white and the pink is a painting by an artist named Mondrian. And a lot of people might recognize the painting by Mondrian, but the truth is all three of these paintings are by the same artist. They're all by Mondrian. The one in the upper left is from 1901. The one in the upper right is 1917, and the one in the front is from 1937. And the reason I find it pertinent to our conversation is change is a good thing. Mm-hmm. But the key is you have to explain to people why you're changing and how the change is going to impact them. So even something as slight as saying, you know what, I need to write this down. Hold on, I'm getting pen and paper. I'm going to write this down because what you're saying is important to me, rather than just taking a piece of paper and they can't see it. Change is a positive force, but we have to change how we implement the change and be able to explain the hows and whys and not just charge forward, because you can't have those conversations by the water cooler. You can't have lunch with someone or say, come grab a cup of coffee with me to further explain what happened in the meeting. You have this one chance. And I believe the change and innovation are always warranted, but you need to be able to explain the how and the why.
I've noticed that in particular when we do virtual roundtables as well. And one thing that I've noticed when you're doing a roundtable in person, it's a lot easier to read and navigate the group. When you're doing it virtually, you have to be a lot more proactive in pulling them into the discussion. And it's the same way with meetings as well. Even if you're one-on-one or the group, you kind of have to, if you're directing a question to somebody, you can look at them, but you can't look at them. It's like if you're in a real in-person setting, you look at somebody and they know you're directing the question at them. Now you have to call them out. So you have to be a lot more clear in your communication. And then just like we said before, you can't make any assumptions about anything unless you ask a question to clarify that assumption.
Right. That's right. And one of the things that I find muddies the waters, and people have started to take this personally, is when they turn their cameras off. And, I get it. There are some people that are not comfortable being on camera, but it's really not an option when you're having a conversation. I don't want to just hear your voice. I want to see you. Mm-hmm. And I'm not being selfish. I want to know that you're all in, and if you're sitting in your pajamas knitting, I have no problem with that. But there are a million reasons my mind is going why the camera is off. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes it's a necessity. I get it. But when in doubt, turn your camera on, especially if it's a fairly new relationship. And I know it sounds like a small thing, but I have meetings where, 2 or 3 of the cameras are off and everybody else is on. Who am I going to pay attention to? I'm going to pay attention to the people that are there. And I mean there, so I can see them. Small thing.
And a lot of buyers, not a lot, but there are some buyers who are guilty of that. The suppliers, I don't think I've ever seen a case of a supplier with their camera off because they want to show their products. But the buyers, in some cases, there'll be several of them and one buyer may have it off. And you're right. Even if it's unintentional, you'll just feel that they're ignoring you, even if that's not the case. And I think, like you said, if they said ahead of time, hey, listen, I'm outside in whatever and I can't put my camera on, or, if they're in a situation where they can't, just let them know. And that's why I can't. But I agree. I think it's important to have it on.
It is. And, I've had people say, look, I'm driving. I'm running late and I'm in the car. I'm listening to all of you. I'm here. And as soon as I get to my destination, I'll turn the car on. Mm-hmm. I'm fine with that. But just to turn your camera off as a matter of course, not a good tactic. And one of the other things that you said that made me think about something in the presentation was the idea when you said about looking at things differently and thinking about your resources to solve problems. It reminded me of the pictures that I'm showing you now. We live in New York City. You know that on days that it rains, these guys show up in the subway. I don't know where they are on sunny days, but they want to sell you a $5 umbrella. They're everywhere. Every subway station, every exit.
I call them disposable umbrellas.
I'm sorry?
Disposable umbrellas, basically.
Exactly. And I'm one of the suckers who never listens to the weather in the morning, so I never have an umbrella. So I took these pictures. These pictures are from Union Square, where I live, and that's my green umbrella in the garbage can on the left. And it happened that, of course, I bought one of the disposable umbrellas, and the first gust of wind that comes, your umbrella turns upside down, without a doubt, right? And I'm looking around, everybody else is intact, and mine turns upside down. So what do? I curse the $5 umbrella, and I threw it in the garbage. But I also looked around and I was kind of comforted by the fact that other people had sucky umbrellas too. Like there were so many broken umbrellas in the garbage that day. And what did I do then? I went back down into the subway and bought another umbrella because I was out of it. But the artist Jean Shin had a different idea. She went around New York City after 5 or 6 times. She pulled these broken, failed umbrellas out of the garbage and she took out the handles and she took out the metal. And look what she did with the fabric. She made this sculpture that I think it's very ironic that when you stand under it, it's really quite beautiful. It was actually in Long Island City. It shields you from the sun. Now, I know that people in ECRM are not walking around New York City pulling failed umbrellas out of the garbage. But my question for you and for them is, how do you see potential in things that fail other people? Mm-hmm. Especially now during a pandemic, how do you take an issue or an idea or a product and when you say, I think this can work for us, and someone you work with says, nope, I've tried it before, it's not going to work, or I don't think it's going to work. How do you articulate how you see potential in something? Mm-hmm. And I think it could be relevant to your members because when you talk about shelving and presentation and marketing, what if you see potential and someone comes up to you and says, nope, not going to work? What do you do with that? That's in a virtual realm.
Exactly, because that's one of the things during the discussions when the supplier's talking to the buyer, not only are they showing the products, but they're also showing or they're going to describe or discuss how they're going to help that buyer sell that product in their stores. What kind of support are they going to give it? What kind of promotional support, trade spend, social media? Are they going to be doing demos? What are they going to do to help move the product once it's on the shelves? And that's part of that whole pitch. And it varies from supplier to supplier and what the retailer or the buyer needs. What's going to trigger that interest is going to be different from one buyer to the next.
Absolutely. And what I want people to be able to do is look at the egg and see the flying bird. I want them to be able to look at one thing and envision another. And that takes work in a virtual platform. It takes work to hear what somebody says and think, well, I can make that work with that product, or I can do that. And I had a colleague recently who said, yeah, every time I look at an egg, I end up with yolk on my face. I'm okay with that. You know why? Because there are no successes without failures. Mm-hmm. And it's a weird thing called survivorship bias. We only look at the things that work and try to replicate them instead of looking at the things that fail and saying, you know what, I don't want to do that.
Mhm.
So, I think that this pandemic, and when it goes, when it's finally in the rearview mirror, there's going to be something else that limits our circumstances. And these are tools that are timeless to be able to look at resources differently going forward, because I don't want anybody to revert to 10 months ago and say, okay, I want to get things back to normal. There's never going to be a normal again. It's going to be a new normal. And I want people to have the tools to be able to deal with it.
So speaking of things not working, I know you're a big proponent of contingency plans, and things can happen during a meeting. One, there could be technical issues, but those are usually resolved pretty quickly, or and if not, we reschedule them. But in the conversation, there could be like things are just not working. What are your thoughts on that? On setting contingency plans?
I'm going to skip ahead, and I'm going to show you a slide that illustrates this better than I can. And I'm just skipping ahead. Do I have it? I do not. Okay. So here's the thing about contingency plans. I usually show a slide of two clocks, two battery operated clocks, and they're a work of art. And they're set to exactly the same time, minute, hour, and second. And the artist said, these clocks always have to be in perfect synchronicity, but you can't alter the clocks. So if these clocks are hanging in a museum, what do? How do you keep, if they're both on batteries, how do you keep them in perfect time? Do you constantly make sure the time is the same? Some people say, well, take out the batteries. Can't do that, that you're altering the work of art. The answer is there is no answer, but you have to come up with some way to keep the clocks in perfect synchronicity. And the fact that we have to have that discussion reminds you that you have to have a contingency plan at all times, especially for the things that you don't think you need a contingency plan, because things happen. Things go wrong, especially when you don't expect them to go wrong. And, the perfect example I'll give you is last Wednesday in the Capitol. I'm not going to get political at all, but we had something major go wrong and there was no contingency plan. I was in New York City on 9/11, no contingency plan. And we only make them when there's catastrophe or the potential of catastrophe. But I tell people, you need to have plans A, B, C, and D. I have a backup computer. I sent my presentation to myself on Dropbox in case we had a technical issue. I have it on my phone because you know what? I never know if something's going to go wrong. And I know we were meeting at 10 today and I didn't want anything to go wrong. You need contingency plans for the smallest of issues and the big presentations because nobody can see into the future. Nobody saw a pandemic coming. And so who was the deer in the headlights? And some people, it took a day to get a contingency plan in place. Some people already had one. It's absolutely imperative for successful businesses.
And we try to do as much prep ahead of time to account for things that may happen on the technical side. So, we're constantly watching a dashboard to see if anybody hits the contact support button. We optimize their settings before the meetings to make sure that their video and their sound and everything is really good. So we try to address that in advance, but during the actual meetings, things can still happen.
Well, here's one other way to do it. And I'm going to show you with this painting. And I ask the participants in every session, I say, okay, write one sentence to describe what you see in this painting. And they all write pretty much the same thing. It appears to be a train coming out of a fireplace. There are candlesticks on the mantle. There's a clock and there's a mirror. And there's smoke coming out of the train. One of the things that I tell people to do, it is as important to talk about what you don't see as what you do see. And what that concept is called, it's called the pertinent negative. We almost all of us just talk about, oh, I noticed this, I noticed that. But what happens when something doesn't happen? You're really only talking about half the picture. Because if you used what's called the pertinent negative, if you describe this picture to me, I'd want you to say, there's a train coming out of the fireplace. And by the way, there are no tracks under the train. And there is no fire in the fireplace. And if you tell me there are candlesticks on the mantle, tell me there are no candles in them. And I know it sounds counterintuitive to talk about what's not there, but it sort of builds in a contingency and you're actually more descriptive. And so with client relations, one of the things that I tell people to do to help with that contingency, at the end of a meeting or the end of a conversation, you ask them, is there anything we didn't talk about today that you wanted to cover in this meeting? Because not only are you showing concern for them, you're building in a contingency so they don't come back later and say, we didn't address X, and it's very important to me. Ask them what didn't happen and what's important to them, because no two people see anything the same way. And to illustrate this, I have a great real world example. In World War II, the Royal Air Force took a hit from German anti-aircraft fire. Their planes were almost destroyed. And when the planes came back, I'm showing you a picture of the damage of the planes that came back. And they wanted to re-armor, put in reinforcements before they sent the planes out to war again. But they didn't have enough armor to cover the planes, so they had to decide, what parts of these planes do we fix? And everyone said, let's fix all the damage and send the planes out. And it was a mathematician who said, no, we need to re-armor the undamaged parts of the plane, because the planes that were damaged in those parts didn't make it back. That sounds counterintuitive. Let's fix the parts that aren't damaged, but those are the parts that could withstand the firing, and you need to reinforce them there. The pertinent negative is so important, Joe. It's thinking about if you had expectations, or you have the data, something happened in the data, or you had expectations of a behavior or sales and they didn't happen, you need to say that they didn't happen. It's not just that you observed A and B and C, you didn't see D, E, and F. And that's part of a contingency plan, thinking about what didn't happen.
And I think that helps manage the expectations on the part of the buyer.
Yep.
Ahead of time. So this way they know going in what your capabilities are, what they aren't, and what they could be, or what, maybe what they need to be in order to reach that point where they'll put you on the shelf.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So that's my illustration for the pertinent.
Now, wait. I had a question about the planes.
Yeah.
Those red dots, are those where it was shot, where the planes took hits?
Yep.
Okay, wow. That many.
Yes. And so the question was, we have limited resources to reinforce these planes. That's a lot of armor to cover up. And it was this mathematician who said, no, that's not where you need to fix.
Yeah, because they made it back with all those holes in them.
That's right. But the places where they weren't hit, that's what enabled them to get back.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's a counterintuitive way of thinking. And this comes from emergency medicine. I get to steal things from other fields because I work across fields. If somebody comes into the operating room and the doctor thinks they have appendicitis has 3 symptoms. Symptom 1 is present, symptom 2 is present. But if symptom 3 is absent, it's the pertinent negative. You need to say it's not there, because then it's not appendicitis. Mm-hmm. So they call 3 the pertinent negative, what didn't happen. And it's a really important concept. So I use it in every session.
And this is important for suppliers to include the pertinent negatives in their presentation. So if they have a slide deck, make sure it's overt there in their questions and back and forth with the buyers to let them know truly what their capabilities are, what their capabilities aren't. And then also, I think that other thing you mentioned is extremely important, to ask the buyer, what did I miss? That you need to know
about today.
Yeah.
Was there anything? And to continue the plane analogy, I want to show you one more slide that I think is really pertinent to this conversation. It's this one. I always ask my participants, and I throw it out to the group today, how many of you have ever been on an airplane that's experienced turbulence? And of course, everyone raises their hand. Of course, we've all experienced turbulence. And before the pandemic, I was taking so many flights. Turbulence was a way of life for me. And I noticed 2 patterns when turbulence happens, and they're really applicable to business. In the first scenario, the plane starts to move, and the pilot picks up the phone from the cockpit and says, "Hi, Captain Barbara here from the cockpit. Folks, we're going to have about 20 minutes of rough air. I'm going to ask you to take your seats, fasten your seatbelts, flight attendants, suspend beverage service, and I want you to try to refrain from using the restroom if you can. I'll be back in 20 minutes and let you know when we'll be making our initial descent into JFK." Click. And I look what people do. They look at their watches, they put their headphones in, they buckle up. Some people close their eyes and meditate, and everybody's fine. And the plane just like this. When the plane starts to do that and the pilot says nothing, you think you're going to die. People reach for vomit bags. I've had people dig their nails into my arm next to me, total strangers, and they say, "Have you ever experienced this?" And I say, "Yes, it's turbulence." Yeah. But the difference between communicating with the passengers and not communicating with the passengers is unbelievable. Same scenario. The plane is still going through turbulence. And I tell my clients, be the pilot that picks up the phone. Tell your clients, your stakeholders, your vendors, we're going to have a really rough 6 months, but I'm right here. I'm monitoring the situation, and I'm going to keep you updated every step of the way. It's not going to be pretty, And we may come out ahead, we may not, but I'm right here. Rather than letting them float and imagine the worst, be the pilot. Because you know what? We're all in turbulence right now. And the more you can communicate with your stakeholders, the better they're going to feel, not only during the turbulence, but when you come out of it on the other end.
Yeah, absolutely.
It has to do with pertinent negative, what you say and what you don't say. And I can't believe the difference. I just look around, because I like to look around, and I just look at people's faces. And when the pilot says nothing, people really think they're going to die. The overhead bin's open, and people are like, oh my God, this is the end. And I have to say to them, it's not. It's just the pilot doesn't understand how valuable communication is.
Yeah, and anybody that's been through severe turbulence, or if you've just seen TV shows about those Hurricane Hunter airplanes, and you just see how much it takes a lot to bring it. They rarely, if ever, go down by turbulence.
Rarely. I mean,
they can take a beating.
Airport sometimes, they can't land in it. But that communication is so important. And it brings me to one other point that I want to show you. I'm sorry, I have all these visuals for you.
No, please.
I love this photograph. And for those of you who are just listening, can't see it, it's a plate of donuts in a diner, and the glass dome has come down on one of the donuts. And what is the takeaway from this photograph? Things are going to go wrong. Okay? Things are going to go wrong. And we have to understand the consequences of our observations and be able to convert observable details into actionable knowledge. You own the diner. What do you do with the donut? Now, if someone handed me that donut right now, I'd eat it in 20 seconds flat. But the truth is, you have to think about what happened. Do you throw the donut away? Do you give it to a kid for free? Do you leave it there? You have to understand what happened and what are you going to do about it. And the second corollary to that is, and now I've changed slides, you have to realize in every business, not everything can be fixed. And the sooner you realize that not everything can be fixed, this artist, Glenn Taylor, found all this broken porcelain in his mother's attic after she died, and he tried to, quote, fix it. Barbed wire isn't the answer, okay? And so my takeaway from this slide is figure out what you think you can fix, cut your losses and get rid of what you can't fix, and focus those resources on what can be improved. Because if you try to fix everything, it's not going to happen. Nobody has the resources right now to fix everything. And the sooner you make that determination and communicate it, the better you're all going to be.
Yeah, and that's a part of that is, I think, loosely related to your situational awareness and where you are, what you're doing, what tools you have to work with in this new medium.
Absolutely. Know what you can't do. Some things have to fall by the wayside. You can't host, if you hosted a cocktail party at the conference that you used to have and you invited 100 of your best vendors, that's not going to happen anymore. And don't try, if the cocktail hour format, whatever doesn't work for you, rethink it or let it go until we can convene in person again. And to know that given the parameters and the restrictions of where we are, some things can't be fixed, but it doesn't mean you can't come up with a new and innovative way for people to meet each other.
And then, some people are finding that they are able to use these new resources to more effectively or to better communicate than they were.
That's right. And of course, Joe, you've teed me up for a slide. And this is probably a good one to think about how we connect the dots and bringing this all together. What I'm showing you is the Japanese art of kintsugi. And what happens when Japanese artists and ceramicists make their bowls and their vases and their cups, some of them are going to come out with cracks. Some of them are going to be broken. Some of them are going to be asymmetrical or imperfect. And instead of throwing the flawed pottery away, what these artists and ceramicists do is they fill the cracks in with gold and silver and platinum. And you know what happens? These objects become more precious and unique than had they been perfect in the first place. And while none of your listeners, I don't think, are Japanese potters or ceramicists, I can still ask the question, how are you practicing kintsugi? How are you fixing what's broken with the resources that you already have? How are you making it better than it was before?
Interesting.
Yeah. So the idea of shifting lenses and looking at new resources is not just about survival. It's about making your existing platforms and your products and your relationships better than they were before.
And I've seen examples of suppliers doing that in their presentations. On a very basic level, a lot of them are starting to use much better artwork and 3D mockups in their presentation slides.
Mhm.
But also some of them are getting really good at presenting on the screen. Whether they, one example is one supplier, and the name of the company is awesome. It's called Total Cluster Fudge.
That's wonderful.
And she comes and she basically brings her in-person meeting space experience to the screen. She'll have build shelves behind her that look like retail shelves and puts her products on it. She's wearing an apron, a tie, with a logo on it, and she has also underneath her computer, out of sight, a bunch of products. So
Mhm.
that when she'll use some slides, but then when she's talking about the products, she'll demo the products on the screen, um, and that's a whole nother thing to get used to is,
Mhm.
when if you're holding a product up to the screen, how do you do it? One
You
post I
throw it
did,
in the lens, as
yeah, but you got to tilt it forward so that there's no shine mark. So here's the shine mark, but then, so there's so many little things that you have to take into consideration, but they've really found interesting ways to do it. They may have multiple logins, for example, and one is on them, and
Mhm.
then the other camera is on their products so that they can guide them through the products. So we're seeing them kind of adapt and do all of these cool things
Right.
in the virtual environment.
And it's really, it doesn't take genius to do it. It takes time, it takes thought, and it takes focus.
Mhm.
And like the slides I'm showing you now, you don't have to know these two artists. You don't even have to know who they are to see the commonality, to see
Mhm.
what works, to see why they're similar. And you have to really think about what's going to work and what's the train of thought and be deliberate about it. It's not just going to come to you. But I also want people to appreciate asymmetry, to
Mhm.
appreciate things that look different. Like I'm showing you a painting, similarities and differences. This is very asymmetrical, and yet it works. And so trying new things, as I said, we don't have the time, financial, or human resources to really go out in the world and find new things, but looking at our existing resources is really very important. And I encourage all my participants to look in the mirror at the end of every day or every week and ask yourself, like in this painting, you're not going to see the reflection of the back of your head, but to ask yourself, what went well this week? What worked?
Mhm.
What didn't work? What really failed? What am I not going to do again? Because self-perception, I think, is critical to professional success. And so what I'm hoping is that this is my last slide, and it has my information, my book, my social media, where I am on social media. But I wanted to give the viewers of this video and the listeners a chance to see what their work looked like before and what their work can look like now. And I've chosen these two portraits of Chuck Close, and the one that he did on the left from 2005. There's nothing wrong with seeing the world this way. It's a white guy with green eyes, round glasses, and a goatee looking right out at you. But I hope that the participants will think their work can look more like the picture on the right done 6 years later. The artist broke down every piece of information and he made it more colorful, more complex, more compelling, more interesting, lowered his glasses to get the big picture and not miss the small details. And I believe if you incorporate some of these tools into your work, it makes you a sharper professional in our new platform and just a more interesting person. There's more to see and more to think about, and you'll be better prepared when the next pandemic, catastrophe, disaster happens. And these are tools that are timeless and that I hope they'll help your listeners to process and make their businesses as best they can be given our circumstances.
Excellent. Well, thank you. This is great information. I think, just to recap, it's really the importance of being more observant, observing the right things, what things are actually, and then using communication to clarify and make sure that what you're seeing is what you're perceiving and hearing and doing is clear on both sides, in both directions.
Exactly. And none of it's rocket science. Everybody can do it because everybody sees something and everybody can, improve and change. And I think it's better for business all around.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I love the it's a different perspective, but like you said, It's not rocket science. It's very simple. It's just a matter of applying it and being more observant.
That's exactly it. So thanks so much for having me, Joe. It was a lot of fun talking to you.
Thank you.
Take care.